Spotlight. I'm Chrissy Wozniak. Today, we have the privilege of sitting down with a true visionary in the field of agricultural engineering, sustainability, and food production. Our guest is not just a professor at Iowa State University, he's a researcher, scientist, engineer, author, and podcast host whose work spans the diverse realms of grains, foods, biofuels, beverage alcohols, and sustainable agricultural systems. Today, we're going to delve into his remarkable journey, explore the impact of his work in the agricultural landscape, and gain insights into the future of farming and engineering solutions. From Ames, Iowa, I would like to welcome Dr. Kurt Rosentrater. Welcome, Kurt, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Chrissy, thank you so much for the invitation. It really is a pleasure for me too. And as we were preparing for this, we were commenting that it's always great to meet a fellow podcaster.
Yes, absolutely. So let's start off with your background. How did you get to where you are today?
So, Chrissy, where would you like me to start?
You were born on.
A long time ago, I was born in Northwest Iowa, small town, about 1,000 people. It's been about 1,000 people through the farm crisis, even up to today. It sits between the towns of Cherokee and Storm Lake, and each of those towns has had a long, interesting journey in terms of meatpacking companies and agricultural economies. And one town is doing remarkably well over the years, and the other is not. And
Mm.
but I grew up on a small, well, at the time we thought it was large. Nowadays it was, thinking back, it's quite small, about 1,000 acres of
Wow.
corn and soybeans. And we did farrow to finish, and we also had beef cattle herd. So my first memory of actual work on the farm, I think I was about 7 years old, and my grandfather sent my brother and myself out to scoop out the feed bunks because the silage, there were portions of the feed bunks that were not being consumed by the cows, so we had to clean that out. And I got to tell you, that was a horrible job. But for a
I'm sure.
7-year-old, it's a good introduction.
Yep, that's it. And then where did your interest in agriculture just keep getting stronger through high school and college?
Well, I wanted to. My grand plan in life was to stay at home and farm. That was what I thought I was going to do. And when you're a kid, everything on the farm is really cool. Driving the tractor, driving the combine. That was the very best thing to do, was to drive the combine. And that you're reaching a certain level of maturity and responsibility when they let you drive the combine. So I planned to be a farmer. And when I was in high school, I came to the realization that my uncle was going to inherit the farm, not myself. So I had to figure out a different plan in life. And back in the 1980s, biotechnology was starting to become a hot topic. And this was before we had really a lot of GMO types of products on the marketplace. And I remember walking beans and then riding the bean buggy and then saying, oh my gosh, it would be so much better if we could utilize biotechnology to make our lives easier, because I really hated walking beans. And that was just not a lot of fun. But I do think every kid should do it in their lives. It's a character building
Yeah.
experience. So I came to Iowa State and I planned on majoring in ag biotechnology. And the first couple of semesters, I came to the realization that chemistry and biology are actually pretty hard stuff. And so I kind of lost interest. But I kind of wandered around a little bit. I was thinking about different kinds of majors. I was really passionate about FFA in high school, and I spent quite a lot of time working on different committees at the district and the state level with FFA. And so I was thinking, how could I incorporate that? But somehow I stumbled into ag engineering. And I think it was some of my FFA friends that convinced me to come talk to a few of the professors in the ag engineering department. And it was like a light bulb turned on. And this is
Wow.
what I wanted to do. And so I started taking the engineering classes. And it really was eye-opening. How can you use technology to improve what we do on the farm and then after the farm? And so I decided I was going to major in ag engineering, and I was really interested in grain, especially grain production and grain processing, and then what happens downstream from that point. And I enjoyed it so much, I decided to stay for graduate school and pursued my master's degree and a PhD, all related to grain processing and grain
Wow.
utilization. Um, After I was finished with my master's degree, when I was working on my PhD, an opportunity came up to work for a company here located here in Ames, Todd and Sargent Incorporated. So they design and build grain elevators and feed mills and flour mills. And so I jumped at that opportunity, and the PhD kind of was a part-time gig for a while until I finished. But I got the chance to design several grain elevators and feed mills and flour mills, and
Mm.
actually put into practice what I was learning at college. And I have to say, I learned a lot at Iowa State, but I learned a lot when I was actually doing the work in industry. And um, it was just absolutely incredible to take an idea and then design a facility and see it actually constructed and operational. And
That.
it is just so incredible. Um, After several years, I thought I would try my hand at being a teacher. So I went to Northern Illinois University, and opportunity came to be a professor there. And I taught engineering and design for a few years. But as it turned out, one of my teachers that had been at Iowa State had joined the USDA Agricultural Research Service. And he was trying to twist my arm. And if he's listening to this podcast, I'll actually say thank you for this. Uh, the USDA ARS is the in-house research arm of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and an opportunity came up in both their Wynmore, Pennsylvania lab outside of Philadelphia, as well as a similar opportunity in Brookings, South Dakota, to work with the biofuels. It was working with the biofuels industry, but specifically trying to make the production process more efficient, but also utilize byproducts better. And this was right after, or shortly after 9/11, when the biofuels industry had not really started to grow exponentially. And so it was really amazing to work on helping build an industry. And most of my work focused on distillers grains, use in beef, dairy, swine, poultry, and other things. And it was an incredible experience. But about 10 years ago, uh, some folks at Iowa State called me up and said, "Hey, we've got an opportunity for you. Do you want to come back and be a professor here?" So
Wow.
uh, I came back to Iowa State. I've been here a little over 10 years, and I teach grain processing and food processing and fermentations and biofuels. And that sort of leads us to today.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. And so in your research at Iowa State University, what are you focusing on there? I know that's so diverse. That seems like so many different things.
Well, that's a blessing and a curse, I think, all at the same time,
Yeah.
because there is still so much work to do in terms of the biofuels industry.
Mhm.
And somebody asked me, gosh, it must have been maybe 9 or 10 years ago. Well, you've been working in this area for so long. Surely you've answered all the questions.
Mhm.
And I had to laugh, and I still use that quote today, because there are so many things happening in biofuels, and even the corn ethanol industry is still really dynamic. And
Wow.
what I'm really excited about is the fact that over the last 20 years, uh, here in the United States, we have been able to fully utilize that kernel of corn and not just produce ethanol, but also corn oil that we can extract and use for either livestock feed, biodiesel, or industrial chemical production. But oh, by the way, we can also separate and use that protein and the fiber for different things, especially if we're talking about monogastric feeds like swine, poultry, but also aquaculture and pet foods.
Mm.
And I am just extremely excited about the opportunities that protein separation has for the biofuels industry. And then that's not even talking about the sustainable aviation fuels or renewable
Yeah.
diesel. I mean, it's such a dynamic and diverse industry in terms of the opportunities in front of us.
Yeah, for sure. And so you describe yourself as a multidisciplinary creator. So can you elaborate on that? What does that mean?
Oh, that's a tough question, Chrissy. Uh, that's a really tough question. So I was trained as an engineer, and working at the company, I was an engineer. But when I transitioned to the USDA, it, it was different. It was more research and science.
Mhm.
And how do you plan experiments to solve a question? And that's what my national program leader actually told me the first time that we met. I would think I was on the job for maybe 2 weeks. And I met my national program leader at the fuel ethanol workshop in Madison, Wisconsin. And he sat me down and said, Kurt, you know what you need to do? And I'm like, I have no idea. What am I supposed to do? I've never worked for USDA before. The ARS is a new thing for me. He said, talk to the people in industry, figure out what the problems are, and solve those problems, which
That's a
basically
great start.
said nothing and everything all at the same time. So,
Yeah.
for me, I think over the years, meeting with companies, meeting with livestock producers, meeting with farmers, trying to understand what are the challenges and the problems that they have, whether it's producing corn, feeding cows, doing the ethanol manufacturing process or the protein separation process. What are the problems, and how can we do research? How can we do work to try to make the process more efficient, make it better, make it more sustainable? And so I think I try to incorporate that in my teaching aspects too, because the grain industry, while there are a lot of similar things that we see in place that have been there for 100 years or more, there are a lot of innovative things going on. And uh, whether it's AI systems, robotics, or sensors and control systems that are helping preserve the grain on the farm or at the elevator, or do the process, whatever the final product is, there are so many problems that need to be addressed. You can't be just in a single lane your entire career. And so I think what I try to do is spread not just my interest, but also who else do I need to work with? What other areas do I need to consider? And if you remember, I went away from ag biotechnology because I thought it was difficult as a first and second year student. Well, the funny thing is, industrial fermentation is all biotechnology. And so every day it's all about yeasts and enzymes and microorganisms, and how do we make the starch more accessible? How do we break the fiber down? And so you've got to do a lot of different things. You can't sit in a silo and be effective as a teacher or a researcher. So, but I've also been concerned over the years in terms of people that are working in the grain industry that, there's been a lot of retirements. A lot of people have been passing away over the last several decades that have had a large body of knowledge. And, things related to storage of grain, drying of grain, preservation of grain. And so I've spent some time over the years working on a series of books that really are trying to compile what do we know and what are the next steps in terms of the grain industry, in terms of keeping the grain preserved and functional and able to be processed. So it was some point during the last few years. I think it was during COVID. It was one of those things where, what do you do during COVID? You write a book about grain storage.
Yeah.
And then
So many great things came out of that.
I don't know how many people sat down and said, I want to write a book about grain storage during COVID, but I was one of them. But, I was thinking quite a lot about, how can we as an industry continue to make a difference in the world? And I know so many people that will go to the grocery store that are so far removed from the production of the ingredients that go into their food. How do we tell our story? How do we get the message out? I know there's a set of people in industry and researchers who have a very strong interest in the preservation of grain. And so the knowledge that we produce at Iowa State and other universities will be used to build grain elevators and feed mills. But what about the people who are not necessarily directly involved in agriculture? How do we get the message out? And I guess that was a thought that led to the generation of my podcast, which it's not even a year old, but I'm really interested in trying to get the message out about grain, and it's really interesting too because when I meet with my students at the beginning of every semester, some of them come from the farm, some of them don't, and some of them have experience with grain, and a lot of them do not. And so it really just astounds me. We as a species, we've been cultivating grain for thousands of years. The oldest known record of grain storage is 12,000 years ago in Jordan.
Wow.
We have been and we continue to cultivate grain and use grain for humans and not just food, but our other needs as well. So I think there's a huge opportunity for all of us working in agriculture to try to get the message out. And, hopefully by the efforts of yourself and many others, consumers will start to understand. I hate to think about going back 100 years ago, but 100 years ago, when the majority of people in the US were involved directly in production ag, people knew a lot more about where their food came from.
I think about that a lot. If we've lost so much that even just 2 generations ago, just my grandmother knew how to make bread. Right? And that came from grain. I bet you if you asked a child or asked even a teenager right now, where did your bread come from? They would probably have no idea. And that's another step removed from where I am, where my generation is, where at least we knew our grandma knew. Yeah,
Exactly.
so it feels very vulnerable. What do you think?
I think so. I think, you know, during COVID, it was so interesting. So many people were trying their own yeast starter cultures at home and making bread at home. And remember the yeast shortage in the grocery
Yeah.
stores around the US, and then the flour shortage. And, you know, it was really interesting. So many people were trying to sort of go back to our roots as
Mhm.
humans. Um, I decided I would jump on that bandwagon too and not do the bread machine approach. We make a lot of bread at our house, and we go through bread machines pretty frequently because we make quite a lot of bread. But yeah, it's not so easy to make a yeast starter culture from
No,
scratch.
I guess
It's
not.
not.
So how did they do it? Like, how did those people who we see as like our dumb ancestors, they knew these things. How did they do it?
That is such an interesting question. Um, I think it's a complex, interesting question to ask because you think about beer, or you think about bread, and you know those were two staples of human societies for thousands of years.
Yeah, for
And
all of recorded history, right? Right from the
yeah,
beginning.
exactly. And actually, there's an interesting argument amongst historians and anthropologists over the years. Why did the agricultural revolution begin? And is it because people wanted more food or wanted more beer? And actually, it's about a 50-50 split, at least amongst
Wow.
the people that I've talked to and the research that I've done. Uh, but how clever a person, was it just simple observation? Was it experimentation? It had to be a combination of all of the things, especially because people didn't know about microorganisms until the
Yeah.
1800s. So, um,
Hey, even the Last Supper was bread and wine.
absolutely,
Never really thought
absolutely.
about that before, yeah.
Fermented and fermented. But
Mhm.
the history of grain is entwined with the history of humans.
Yeah.
And I think so many people have lost that concept that food just does not come from the grocery store, but it takes a lot of hard work to actually, whether it's steak or a loaf of bread or whatever it is that you buy at the grocery store, there's a lot of work behind that. It's not just a package.
Yeah, for sure. So why did you start your podcast? The podcast is the Cereal Grain Cafe. And I love that. That's a great title. But so what led you to do that? I know you touched on that a little bit before.
I think it was after the latest book that I had released. I was thinking about this whole idea of people being separated from the farm and separated from agriculture, and who cares about grain? Well, everyone should care about grain because uh, so many people consume grain-based products or products that contain grain-based ingredients, even if they don't realize it. And there are thousands of products that are made with grain that touch our daily life, that are not food, that are, whether it's something related to our detergents or clothing. um, there are so many products, and it I guess I started the podcast because I was thinking there's nothing else out there that's talking about why people should care about grain. And grain is such an interesting and multifaceted aspect, really nowadays an unknown aspect of our society, unless you are actually actively involved in production agriculture or processing.
Right.
And so I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to talk to people who are doing research, people who are working in the field, that are actually doing hands-on things related to grain? And will this will it have an interest in the common consumer? I'm not sure, but it for me has provided a great opportunity to meet a lot of people and have deep conversations, which I really do appreciate. And I think it motivates me to know that there are so many people who are passionate about agriculture and about grain, as much as I am, and that are doing so many interesting things.
Yeah, that's incredible. And so who is your ideal listener that you're targeting? Like for this show, for me, it's the producer and agribusiness, and giving a seat at the table so that everybody in the industry has a voice and can talk about what they're passionate about and what drives them and what's driving the industry forward. And then for what colors your tractor, that listener, my ideal listener there is the person that loves tractors and people in marketing, right? To talk about the brands. So who is your ideal listener?
I would really like to have listeners across the spectrum from farm to table. In
That's awesome.
reality, at the moment, I think the majority of my listeners are students,
Mhm.
and that's great because what better way to understand the complexities of the grain industry and how that relates to the rest of society? And there are so many different things, and I've been talking to students not just here at Iowa State, but I do work in other countries as well. Um, I'm especially proud of some of the work in sub-Saharan African countries where, similar problems, but completely different scale. And how do you motivate people to work in the industry? And I think that's, for me, that's really satisfying that so many students are listening, both undergraduate as well as graduate students. But ideally, the listener base would be great if we had people from farm to table.
Yeah. 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 We need to find every one of us need to find ways to bridge that divide, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So in your experience working in the grain processing industry for over 30 years, what are some really remarkable, significant changes that you've witnessed over those years?
So 30 years sounds like a long time. That sounds like a long time. Uh, it was really interesting. I was working at Todd and Sargent as a design engineer before the ethanol boom came. I was working there during 9/11. I was actually working on designing a freezer facility for one of the IME's pet food processing plants.
Wow.
And I still remember that day. Um, but I remember I went to I think it was a Corn Refiners Association meeting, conference, and the discussion shortly after 9/11 was dry grind ethanol plants. Hey, what's a dry grind ethanol plant? And there were very few of them at the time. And this is going to be the next big thing in the industry. And lo and behold, it was. And it took the US Corn Belt by storm post
Wow.
9/11. And it was so exciting to be part of a mission to help build an industry. For me, that was probably the most exciting part of my career, is to have ridden the wave of building all of these ethanol plants. And oh, what are we going to do with all the DDG? And oh, where are we going to get all the corn? And isn't it great that we can use a domestic supply of our own production to produce our own gasoline? And the research that we were doing, not just myself, but the team of researchers at USDA, as well as universities around the country, there were so many people working in this space. It was probably the most exciting thing I will ever experience, because we
Wow.
knew we were making a difference. And
That's cool.
um, you know, post post that experience, I think there are interesting other experiences and trends that I've witnessed. Gluten-free grains or ancient grains, it's every year is a different one in terms of
Mhm.
popularity. I remember several years ago when quinoa was the grain of the year, and that was really popular, and people started eating quinoa. I don't know if you like quinoa or not, Chrissy, but
It's good in salads. That's I don't
uh,
make it at home, but I'll eat it in a salad at a restaurant.
yeah, for me, I'm not such a fan,
Yeah.
but
I like grits though, so
oh, me too. Oh yeah, me too. Um, and this year is the year of the FAO's year of millets, and
Oh.
there's it's so interesting to see all of the different cereals that are grown around the world for different uses, but primarily, especially for human food use.
Mhm.
And there are a lot of opportunities. Foxtail millet, for example. I used to spray that with Roundup as a kid, and
Right.
it's a weed. Well, in the
Mhm.
U.S., it's a weed. In other countries, it's a food source. So
Wow.
there are some really interesting research studies that need to be done for a variety of things. And then there are some of the new things, like the Land Institute is really interested in Kernza.
Hmm.
It's a perennial wheat, basically, or wheatgrass. The yield is really low, so they're trying to improve the yield, but apparently the carbon sequestration, because the roots go so deep, apparently it's really fascinating. But
Really?
by the way, there's very little work done on this in terms of using it as a beer or as a pasta. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And so what excites me in terms of new things, all of these different grains, well, what can we do with them, and how do we actually process them into foods that we can eat? And there's so much work to be done.
Wow. Yeah, that's really cool. And can you share some examples of current projects or initiatives that you're involved in that have the potential to impact ag and food production, even globally?
Yeah, I would say probably in terms of my US based work, I am still heavily interested in corn ethanol and the processing of corn ethanol. But what's really exciting right now is the whiskey boom around the country. So apparently, whiskey is, for the last few years and projected into the future, whiskey is booming and it's growing exponentially. And it's so interesting because the corn ethanol industry was born out of technologies based in the whiskey production industry, uh, but we've had to adapt and modify and change how we produce alcohol, because we're not selling $20 a gallon or $50 a gallon bottles. We are selling, a commodity that we're lucky if it's $1 a gallon or so, depending on the year. So we've had to be really efficient,
Right.
and from the time the corn enters the dump pit until the time the ethanol leaves on the tanker car. And so the whiskey industry is growing in every state because there's been a series of laws that have changed federally that have allowed small whiskey producers to start producing. But hey, what do we do with the byproducts? Oh, we've got a lot of byproducts that are being produced. Oh, we can't put those down the drain anymore and have the city deal with them, like the city of Louisville, for example, because there are too many distilleries downtown. And there are so many places around the country that are trying to adapt technology from the corn ethanol industry into the whiskey production industry
Hmm.
to increase efficiency, to lower costs, to be more sustainable, to deal with the byproducts. And so I'm really excited about the whiskey industry. And okay, I'm excited about the tastings, but I'm really excited about the opportunity to make the industry better and make
Mm.
it more efficient. Um, so that's sort of where I'm focusing a lot of my work the last several years here in the U.S. Um, Overseas, it's a little bit different. So the work I do in Africa is really on the village level, on the uh, small farmer level, and different questions. I was just in Ghana a few months ago and did a training program for USAID. It was all related to storage of grain. How do you dry grain? How do you store grain? And when you have losses that are 20, 30, 40, even more percent on the farm due to insects and mold, well, a grain dryer or a grain cleaner for a person that farms 1 acre and they do everything by hand with hoeing and harvesting and everything else by hand, it's a completely different question.
Wow.
Now,
Yeah.
if we had more if there were more economic opportunities, and I think that we'll see some of that in the coming years in terms of farmers banding together, forming cooperatives, something we did here in the US over 100 years ago because of the same kinds of questions. How can we increase our economic power so we can purchase or we can store grain as a community, we can dry grain as a community? I think we'll see that coming. But at the moment, a lot of the work is how do we store, a few 100 pounds of corn in my house, and I don't want the rats to eat it, the insects to eat it, and how do I prevent it from being moldy? And so you've got to think differently in terms of we got to approach this in a different way.
Yeah, was just had that problem this week. Hurricane Idalia came through. We just got the outer bands here in Southwest Florida, and my papaya tree fell down. So I have so much papaya. And the same thing, I'm like, how do I preserve it? Right? How do you preserve it? So I've kind of made like a makeshift cooler that's open, that's in the house in the air conditioning and hoping that it'll just slowly ripen, but we'll see. But that is a big issue. And another thing that you made me think of is there's a Echo Global Farm here in Fort Myers. Are you familiar with them?
I'm not terribly
No?
familiar.
Well, next time you come to Florida to visit, you're going to have to go there. I think you would
Okay.
love it.
Okay.
Echo Global Farm. And what they do is they are a global organization that's always trying to better technology for farmers in third world countries. And whether that's breeding genetics, whether that's making tools. And something interesting, I had her on the show in the spring, and something very interesting that she said, it was something you brought up, was that when you're giving tools to people in those countries, they can't run to the gas station and they can't fix something that's highly mechanical, and they have all of these limitations. So how can we give them tools that they can use in that place that might be not as advanced as we have, but something that they can use in their communities? I thought that was really interesting. I never would have thought that we'd be thinking that way in the world today.
Yeah, it is. It is really interesting. I remember before COVID spending time in Malawi, and there were some large concrete grain elevators that were built a few decades ago that had been abandoned. and they were basically mothballed because they were not effective for the community. And yeah, it's not just a matter of let's drop in our technology. You've got
Right.
to have it adapted to local needs and local situations.
Yeah, yeah, that's really fascinating. There's so much to think about that we just don't don't spend time thinking about in the world. I guess we run out of time thinking,
We
but
do. I agree. I agree.
this is why I don't watch TV very much.
I
All
know
these
the
things to think about.
same thing for me too. Yeah.
Yeah. So, how has the concept of wise management of natural resources evolved over the years? And what are some innovative approaches that to achieving this goal in modern agriculture? I know it always feels like we're there, but I know we can't be there.
Where do you want to talk? Do you want to talk at the processing plant, at the farm level? What are you thinking?
Yeah, whatever comes to your head first, right? Whatever you're most.
One of the things that comes to my mind in terms of resources
Mhm.
is I'm going to start on the farm because um, I teach courses at Iowa State related to agriculture and agricultural themes, and we always seem to be having the discussion about inputs on the farm, and whether it's fertilizers, chemicals, treatments for seeds, but then also the machinery that we use. Um, I have to say, I remember walking beans, and that was a horrible experience. Actually, detasseling corn was the worst experience.
Yeah.
I uh, Everyone should do it, but it's for me the worst job I've ever had. But how can we make life easier, more efficient, and how do we utilize what we are using for inputs? So whether it's fertilizer or the chemical inputs, how do we maximize their or optimize their use in the soil or on the plants or in the plants? Um, and I know the Gulf of Mexico is and the hypoxic zone is on a lot of people's minds for a lot of reasons. And how do we improve water quality in Iowa? And how much nitrogen and phosphorus are we shipping down the Mississippi River? And I think there's so much work to be done, but in terms of optimizing the use of those inputs,
Yeah.
when you think about inputs, they are a cost to the farmer, and the farmer doesn't want to lose money by over applying things. So I think the discussion about natural resources, we have to talk about how do we better utilize these inputs, whether it's, these synthetic inputs, natural inputs, or human inputs. And, I think back about and look at statistics. I shouldn't do that. Looking at historical trends is not always a good thing. You think about how many people are involved in production agriculture today versus 100 years ago. My great grandparents moved to Iowa from Sweden and set up a small farm first in South Dakota and then in Iowa. And um, you know, look back at pictures of what they did on the farm, and it was hard manual labor. And then I see a picture of my grandfather on his first tractor, and oh, it was life changing. And we see that trend continuing. How do we optimize the use of humans on the farm when the number of humans are actually decreasing? And
Right.
I remember in high school, uh, one of the FFA contests was public speaking, and my speech was "Rural Exodus: Do we have a future?"
Wow.
And at the time, I guess I didn't realize how this trend has been going on in almost every country for thousands of years. And we make farming more efficient. We make the production of food more efficient, but then we give opportunities for people to do other things. But
Mhm.
I think that's one of the benefits of the ethanol boom over the years is bolstering rural economies. I look back on my hometown and surrounding areas, and if it weren't for the ethanol boom, would they still be there and have as strong economies as they currently have? I don't know if they would. So, um, in terms of natural resources, I think the the work that's being done by many companies, the work that's being done by many researchers, I think that is helping improve um, the situation on farms across the US, but also globally, because these trends are global. They're not
Mm.
just relevant to the US. People I talk to in other countries, even in Ghana, um, my children don't want to be farmers. I don't know what I'm going to do with my farm when I need to retire. So
Wow.
it's same
Even
kinds of
there.
conversations. Yeah.
Huh. Wow. Unbelievable. Yeah. And we're down to 2% of the population, right? Are
Or
farmers. And
less, perhaps. Yeah.
yeah.
So, um, if I had the chance, would I be a farmer? Absolutely. I would have stayed. That's what I would have done with my life. But okay, since that wasn't an option, what can I do that's related to farming that can make it better or make it more efficient? And, for the long term, we've got to keep moving forward. We can't sit back and say, well, we've done enough. Good luck. We've got to keep trying.
Yeah. Great point. So,
So,
what advice do you give to your students who are, or students that are listening, if they're interested in pursuing a career in ag engineering or related fields?
oh, it depends on the day. It really depends on the day, and what kind of mood I'm in. Because, I try to be an optimist
Mhm.
about a lot of things, and it's easy to get pulled down by there's a lot of things in the news that are not necessarily positive.
Mhm.
So I think if whether you're a student or whether you are a farmer or whether you're a consumer, I think the opportunities are here if you just take advantage of them. And you don't have to take big steps, small steps. You just got to keep taking small steps. Um, what's the old saying about a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step?
Yeah.
And, you know, don't be afraid to try things in life. That's what I always tell them. And if you do something and you don't like it, change. You don't have to stay with this company or with this work situation or whatever the situation is, change. Um, and I think that's for me. I've tried to live that philosophy. Do your best and just keep taking small steps every day. And eventually you'll look back and say, "Oh my gosh, wow, where have the years gone?" And here are the things that have been accomplished in those years. Whether it's at a company, whether it's at a federal or a state agency, whether it's on your own farm. I think the worst thing I think is to just be stagnant and not keep trying to innovate and do new things. So I
Yeah.
don't know what it's
Great
worth,
point.
but that's those are my random thoughts for the day.
Yeah, I love it. Great points. And you're also an author. So, can you tell us about some of the books and publications that you've written?
Sure. Happy to. So years ago, gosh, it's been more than 10 years ago, when I was doing a lot of distillers grain work with USDA. There really 20 years ago there were not a lot of publications or information available about distillers grains, and this was kind of a problem for farmers, livestock producers, livestock nutritionists. How do we use these things, and how do we optimize their use in our beef ration or our dairy ration, or pick a species? um, and so it dawned on me that, instead of just doing scientific papers, why not write a book about what is the state of knowledge about distillers grains? So I'm looking back over the last 10 years and saying to myself, there's a lot of stuff that's changed in the ethanol industry. And some people say distillers grains today are not the same thing as they were 20 years ago. Well, it depends. It really depends. Some companies have changed things significantly and some have not. So
Mm.
the idea was, let's make a compendium of knowledge, and I had probably 30 authors from around the U.S., different universities, and different nutritionists, different scientists, and researchers uh, that contributed chapters that talked about anything and everything related to distillers grains, from corn on the farm to the conversion process, the separation process, and then how do you optimize the use in the different livestock species. Um, then after my time with USDA, I was at Iowa State, and it was actually for my grain processing course. I was looking for a book. My wife thinks I'm crazy. and I don't think she will listen to this podcast, but she thinks I'm crazy because there was a specific book that I wanted to use for my grain processing course called Kent's Technology of Cereals. It was a really great book, but it was 20 some years old, and the author had passed away. And so I contacted my university bookstore and I said, isn't there any way that we could get used books for the students? And apparently there were not enough copies available at the time. But this book was really interesting because from the corn seed until human consumption and every type of process,
Wow.
um, flour mills, feed mills, beverage, alcohol production, everything in between. So I had my university bookstore do a little bit of detective work for me and got me in touch with the publisher. And so I reached out to the publisher and had several conversations. And oh, by the way, the author's widow was still alive, but she held the copyright. The estate held the copyright. So had some conversations with her, and then I flew to London to meet with the family and talk about what would it take to revise this book and make it up to
Mhm.
date book about grain processing. And so they were amenable, and it took a couple of years, but the fifth edition of the Kent's Technology of Cereals came out in 2017.
Wow, that's amazing. Great job.
Well,
Good tenacity.
yeah, it's it needs to be updated yet again because the industry keeps evolving. The
Yeah.
technology we use keeps evolving. And I was thinking with my grain courses, so processing is one aspect, but storage is also equally important. What happens
Mhm.
either on the farm or in the grain elevator. And so my colleagues at the American Association of Cereal Chemistry, also it's now known as the Cereals and Grains Association. I had a set of conversations with them. There was a book that was published about the storage of cereal grains. It came out shortly after World War II, and every once in a while it would be revised, but it had been 20 some years since that last revision. And so I started the process yet again. What would it take to revise this book that has been a staple in the grain storage industry, especially with companies that design elevators and
Mhm.
feed mills and university researchers? And so that was the book that I rewrote during COVID.
Wow.
Uh, and there's been so much that's changed, but there's so much that's the same in terms of how we store grain on the farm, how we store grain at elevators, and throughout the supply chain. So that's sort of the the gist at the moment. I've got a couple of other projects in the works that are not yet published, but hopefully in the next couple of years.
Amazing. Very good. And so I have one last question for you. What gets you up in the morning? What are you most passionate about for what you do?
It's going to sound really corny, by the way. So it really is. Okay, my family is going to be so embarrassed because of my dad jokes, but um, you know, I do get up in the morning and I think about something that always fascinates me is cereal grains, whether it's millet or quinoa or corn or amaranth, they're all the same, but they're all different. And what can we do that nobody's done before that would be really interesting, but also really useful? Because it's one thing to do research that's interesting to you as a scientist, but if nobody cares, I mean, it's kind of a waste. So what can be done, what can be learned that would allow us to get some kind of a benefit, whether it's a livestock feed or a human food or a alcohol, like, or there's so many interesting things going on right now with bioplastics and biochemicals. What can we do with these grains that hasn't been done before? And I know when we talk about the ancient grains, for example, they're a lot more expensive, but it's supply and demand. The supply of these grains is much smaller than corn. There's a reason we grow corn in the Midwest of the US. There's a reason we grow corn in every state of the US, but the concentration is in the Midwest because we can grow corn really well and we can grow a lot of it and we can use all of the parts of that corn kernel. Well, that's not the same for the ancient grains. there are so many untapped opportunities for these ancient grains that, things are different when you look at corn kernels versus other kernels. And, some are not easily, the proteins are not easily extractable from
Hmm.
some of these grains. And so what gets me up in the morning is, hey, what can we learn today? What can we do today that's going to be useful to people, useful to farmers, useful to agriculture that we haven't done before?
I love it. That's awesome. Very cool. And so where can people find you?
So I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, probably more than I should. I'm on LinkedIn quite a lot. Just look for Kurt A. Rosentrater. I'm the only one. Um, I do have my website, the Cereal Grain Cafe, which is also the name of the podcast. But I would say the easiest way to find me is on LinkedIn. Um, you know, I I've played around with Twitter a little bit and Instagram, but I find it easier for me to get my message out through LinkedIn
Right.
because so many people are active on LinkedIn. And I know students who might be listening will say, LinkedIn is like Facebook for old people. Well, it kind of is, but that's what companies use. That's what people use at the moment, anyway. So you can always look for me at the Iowa State webpage or website, iastate.edu. Just search for Kurt Rosentrater, so you'll find my faculty webpage there. But I would say LinkedIn is probably the best way to get a hold of me. Chrissy, will you be putting my contact info in the show notes by chance?
Yes. Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
super.
Whatever you need me to or would
Okay,
like added.
super.
Yep.
I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to engage in conversations. And if there are ideas that people have that are listening, that if you say, hey, this sounds like a really interesting idea, is there any way that you could investigate that in your laboratory? Yeah, I may be able to, or I may be able to connect you to someone who could do that.
Amazing.
So there's a lot of work to do. And Chrissy, we need as many people as possible to continue to move our industry forward.
Yes. Yes, that's for sure. Well, thank you so much, Kurt, for joining me. What a great conversation.
Thank you, Chrissy. It was a pleasure for me also.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone who's watching or listening. If you want to learn more, as Kurt said, all of the links are provided in the show notes. And make sure you go to your favorite podcasting platform and subscribe to the Cereal Grain Cafe. Don't forget to subscribe also to North American Egg Spotlight on YouTube, Rumble, Telegram, or it's also available on Spotify, Apple, Amazon. Listen notes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you like this episode, I would love it if you shared it. And have a great day.